I never expected to bury my child. It's the most unnatural thing in the world, standing beside the polished mahogany casket of your son, watching as they lower it into the ground while you remain above. Richard was only 38. I am 62. This was not how it was supposed to be. The April rain fell in a steady drizzle as we huddled under black umbrellas at Greenwood Cemetery. I stood alone, separated from the other mourners by an invisible barrier of grief that no one dared cross. Across from me stood Amanda, my daughter-in-law, her perfect makeup unmarred by tears, her black Chanel dress more appropriate for a cocktail party than a funeral. She'd been married to Richard for barely 3 years, yet somehow she'd become the center of this ghastly ceremony, while I, who had raised him alone after his father died, was relegated to the periphery. "Mrs. Thompson?" A man in a somber suit approached me as the last of the mourners began drifting toward their cars. "I'm Jeffrey Palmer from Palmer, Woodson & Hayes. I was Richard's attorney. The reading of the will is scheduled to take place at the house in an hour. Your presence is requested." "At the house? Today?" I couldn't keep the surprise from my voice. "Isn't that rather soon?" "Mrs. Conrad," he began, using Amanda's preferred surname before correcting himself. Mrs. Thompson Conrad was quite insistent that we proceed without delay. Of course she was. I had never understood what my brilliant, kind-hearted son saw in Amanda Conrad, with her social media obsession and naked ambition. She'd arrived in Richard's life like a perfectly calculated missile, a former model turned lifestyle entrepreneur whose Instagram following numbered in the millions. Within 6 months of meeting him at a charity gala, she'd moved into his penthouse. Within a year, they were married. I'd tried to be supportive. Richard seemed happy, and after losing his father to cancer 5 years earlier, he deserved whatever joy he could find. But there had always been something calculating in Amanda's eyes when she looked at my son, something that measured his worth in dollars rather than devotion. "I'll be there," I told the attorney, turning away to hide the fresh tears that threatened. Richard and Amanda's penthouse overlooking Central Park was filled with people by the time I arrived. Amanda's friends from the fashion world, Richard's business associates, a few distant relatives I barely recognized. The apartment itself, 21,000 square feet of architectural brilliance that Richard had purchased shortly before meeting Amanda, had been transformed under her influence from my son's warm, book-filled retreat to a sterile showcase worthy of an interior design magazine. The furniture was all sharp angles and uncomfortable minimalism, the walls adorned with abstract art that conveyed nothing but status. "Eleanor, darling." Amanda air-kissed my cheeks, her smile not reaching her eyes. "So glad you could make it. White wine?" "No, thank you," I replied, resisting the urge to wipe my face where her lips had barely grazed my skin. "Suit yourself," she shrugged, turning to greet a tall man in an Italian suit. "Julian, you came." I found a quiet corner, watching the room with growing discomfort. This didn't feel like a post-funeral gathering. It felt like a networking event. People were laughing, exchanging business cards, clinking glasses, as if celebrating rather than mourning. Had they forgotten why we were here? That my son, Amanda's husband, was dead, his body barely cold in the ground? Richard had died in what the police called a boating accident off the coast of Maine. He'd taken the yacht out alone, unusual for him, and somehow fallen overboard. His body had washed ashore 2 days later. The investigation was ongoing, but the authorities suspected he might have been drinking, though that made no sense to me. Richard rarely drank, and never when sailing. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jeffrey Palmer's voice cut through the chatter as he stood near the marble fireplace. "If I could have your attention, please. We're here to read the last will and testament of Richard Thomas Thompson." The room quieted, people finding seats or leaning against walls. Amanda positioned herself prominently in the center of the largest sofa, patting the cushion beside her for Julian to join her. I remained standing in my corner, suddenly afraid of what was to come. "As per Mr. Thompson's instructions, I'll keep this brief," Palmer began, opening a leather portfolio. "This is his most recent will, signed and notarized 4 months ago." 4 months? That was strange. Richard had always been meticulous about his affairs, updating his will yearly on his birthday. His last birthday had been 8 months ago. What had prompted this change? "To my wife, Amanda Conrad Thompson," Palmer read, "I leave our primary residence at 721 Fifth Avenue, including all furnishings and art contained therein." Amanda smiled. as if receiving exactly what she expected. I also leave to Amanda my controlling shares in Thompson Technologies, my yacht Eleanor's Dream, and our vacation properties in the Hamptons and Aspen. Murmurs rippled through the room. This was essentially everything. Richard had built Thompson Technologies from a small startup to a cybersecurity powerhouse worth billions. Those shares alone represented unfathomable wealth. To my mother, Eleanor Thompson, I straightened, bracing myself. Would it be the summer house in Cape Cod that we had shared so many memories in? The collection of first edition books we had hunted together at auctions around the world? The vintage car his father had loved? I leave the enclosed item, to be delivered immediately following the reading of this will. Palmer reached into his portfolio and withdrew a crumpled envelope, visibly worn as if it had been carried in a pocket for some time. "That's it?" Amanda's voice carried clearly across the suddenly silent room. "The old lady gets an envelope? Oh, Richard, you sly dog." She laughed, a tinkling sound like breaking glass. Others joined in. Her fashionable friends, several of Richard's newer business associates, even Julian, who had his hand casually resting on Amanda's knee in a way that seemed strangely intimate for a funeral day. Palmer approached me, discomfort evident in his expression as he handed me the envelope. "Mrs. Thompson, It's fine," I said automatically, the social conditioning of a lifetime forcing politeness through my shock. "Thank you." With everyone watching, some openly smirking, I had no choice but to open it there. My fingers trembled as I broke the seal, aware of Amanda's predatory gaze. Inside was a single first-class plane ticket to Lyon, France, with a connection to a small town called Saint-Michel-de-Maurienne. The departure was scheduled for the following morning. "A vacation?" Amanda called out, causing another ripple of laughter. "How thoughtful of Richard to send you away, Eleanor. Perhaps he realized you needed some time alone, far, far away." The cruelty was so naked, so deliberate, that for a moment I couldn't breathe. Richard, my brilliant, loving son, had left me nothing but a plane ticket to a place I'd never heard of, while giving everything to a woman who could barely wait until his body was in the ground before mocking his mother. "If there's nothing else, Mr. Palmer," I managed, folding the ticket carefully back into the envelope. "Actually, there is one more stipulation," Palmer said, looking uncomfortable. "Mr. Thompson specified that should you decline to use this ticket, Mrs. Thompson, any potential future considerations would be nullified." "Future considerations?" Amanda frowned. "What does that mean?" "I'm afraid I'm not at liberty to explain further," Palmer replied. "Those were Mr. Thompson's explicit instructions." "Well, it hardly matters," Amanda waved dismissively. "There's clearly nothing else of value. Richard left everything to me." She stood, smoothing her designer dress. "I believe this concludes our business. Please, everyone, stay and celebrate Richard's life. The caterers have prepared his favorite foods." As the gathering returned to its inappropriate festivities, I slipped out unnoticed, the envelope clutched in my hand, like the last tenuous connection to my son. In the elevator down to the lobby, I finally allowed the tears to fall, silent sobs that shook my body as I leaned against the mirrored wall. "Why, Richard? Why would you do this to me? What possible reason could you have for sending me to France and giving everything to a woman who never truly loved you?" Back in my modest Upper West Side apartment, the same one I'd lived in since Richard was a child, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the plane ticket. Saint-Michel-de-Maurienne meant nothing to me. I'd been to France once, decades ago as a college student, but never to this place. Richard and I had never discussed it. He'd never shown any interest in that region. Yet he'd gone to the trouble of changing his will specifically to send me there, making it clear that I had to go or forfeit some mysterious future considerations. My sensible side said to ignore it, to contact another lawyer, to contest the will, to fight for what should rightfully have been mine. But something deeper, some instinct I couldn't name, told me to trust my son one last time. The next morning, I packed a single suitcase, called a car service, and headed to JFK Airport. Whatever Richard had planned, whatever awaited me in Saint-Michel-de-Maurienne, I would face it. I owed him that much. As the plane lifted off American soil, I gazed out at the receding coastline, feeling as if I were leaving behind not just my home, but the shattered remnants of the life I had known. Ahead lay only questions, an envelope's mystery, and a tiny French village I'd never heard of until yesterday. "I'm coming, Richard," I whispered to the clouds. Whatever you want me to know, I'm coming to find it. The journey to Saint-Michel-de-Maurienne was long and disorienting. After landing in Lyon, I navigated the French railway system with my rusty college French, eventually boarding a regional train that wound its way into the Alps. Outside the window, the landscape transformed from rolling countryside to dramatic mountains that seemed to touch the sky itself. Tiny villages clung to hillsides, church spires and ancient stone buildings standing sentinel over valleys that grew narrower as we climbed higher. What was I doing here? The question repeated itself with each passing mile. What could possibly await me in this remote corner of France that would explain Richard's bizarre final bequest? By the time the train pulled into the small station at Saint-Michel, my body ached with exhaustion and grief. The platform was nearly empty in the late afternoon light. A few locals, a family with hiking gear, and me, a 62-year-old American widow clutching a crumpled envelope and dragging a suitcase that suddenly seemed far too heavy. As the other passengers dispersed, I stood uncertainly, wondering what I was supposed to do next. Richard's ticket had brought me here, but there were no further instructions, no clue about where to go or whom to meet. Then I saw him, an elderly man in a crisp black suit and driver's cap, holding a sign with my name written in elegant script, Madam Eleanor Thompson. Relief washed over me as I approached him. I'm Eleanor Thompson. The driver, his face weathered by time but his blue eyes remarkably bright, studied me for a long moment. Then, in accented English, he said 5 words that stopped my heart. Pierre has been waiting forever. Pierre. The name hit me like a physical blow, sending me staggering back a step. The driver reached out to steady me, concern crossing his features. Madame, are you unwell? Pierre? I whispered, scarcely able to form the word. Pierre Beaumont? The driver nodded, his expression softening. Oui, Monsieur Beaumont. He sends his apologies for not meeting you himself, but he thought perhaps it would be too much after your long journey and recent loss. Pierre Beaumont was alive. Pierre Beaumont was here. Pierre Beaumont. The name I had buried so deeply in my heart that I had never spoken it aloud in 40 years. The man I had loved with the fierce passion of youth. The man I had believed dead after that terrible night in Paris. The man who, if my suspicions were suddenly, horrifyingly correct, was Richard's true father. How? I managed, my throat constricting around the word. How did Richard find him? The driver's eyes widened slightly. Ah, I think perhaps Monsieur Beaumont should explain. If you'll allow me. He gestured toward a sleek black Mercedes parked nearby. Numbly, I followed him, allowing him to take my suitcase and open the car door. As I sank into the leather seat, my mind raced through calculations I had avoided for decades. Richard had been born 7 months after my hasty marriage to Thomas Thompson. Everyone had assumed he was premature, a common enough occurrence. Only I knew the truth, that he had been conceived in a tiny Paris apartment with blue shutters and a view of the Seine, with a French architecture student who had promised me the world. The driver, who introduced himself simply as Marcel, seemed to sense my need for silence as we left the small town behind, winding up a mountain road bordered by pine forests and breathtaking vistas. Under different circumstances, I might have been captivated by the beauty surrounding us. Now, I barely saw it through the fog of memory and fear. We are nearly there, Madame, Marcel said eventually, as we turned onto a private road marked only by an elegant wrought-iron gate. Chateau Beaumont has been in the family for 12 generations, though Pierre has modernized it considerably. Chateau Beaumont. The name stirred something in my memory. A midnight conversation, limbs entangled in cheap cotton sheets. Pierre's voice passionate as he described the ancestral home he would someday restore to its former glory. I had laughed then, charmed by what I thought was youthful fantasy. Apparently, it had not been fantasy at all. As we rounded the final bend, the chateau came into view, and I gasped despite myself. Built of golden stone that glowed in the late afternoon sunlight, it was a perfect blend of medieval fortress and elegant manor house. Terraced gardens cascaded down the hillside below it, and beyond them, vineyards stretched into the distance, their neat rows creating patterns across the landscape. The vineyards produce some of the finest wines in the region, Marcel commented, pride evident in his voice. Monsieur Beaumont is considered one of France's premier vintners now. Of course he was. Pierre had always been brilliant, driven, passionate about everything he touched. While I had retreated into a safe, small life in New York, he had apparently built an empire here in the mountains of his homeland. The car stopped in a circular drive before the chateau's massive oak doors. Before Marcel could come around to open my door, one of the doors swung open, and a tall figure emerged. Time slowed, the moment crystallizing with impossible clarity. Though his hair was now silver instead of midnight black, though lines now mapped his face where once there had been only smooth olive skin, I would have known him anywhere. Pierre Beaumont at 64 was still unmistakably the man I had loved at 20. He stood utterly still, watching me as I emerged from the car on unsteady legs. Neither of us spoke. What could possibly be said after 42 years of silence? What words could bridge the chasm of a lifetime lived apart, of secrets kept and truths hidden? Eleanor, he spoke finally, my name in his mouth still carrying the same French inflection that had once made my young heart race. Pierre, my voice sounded strange to my own ears, thin and breathless. You're alive. A shadow crossed his face. Yes, though for many years I believed you might not be. Before I could respond to this bewildering statement, a wave of exhaustion and shock overcame me. The world tilted alarmingly, darkness encroaching at the edges of my vision. The last thing I remembered was Pierre rushing forward, his arms, still strong despite the years, catching me before I could fall. When I woke, I was lying on a sofa in what appeared to be a study. Bookshelves lining the walls, a massive desk by the window, a fire crackling in a stone hearth despite the mild spring weather. A blanket had been tucked around me, and someone had removed my shoes. You're awake, Pierre's voice came from nearby. He sat in a leather armchair, watching me with an intensity that made me want to hide and draw closer, simultaneously. Marcel has gone to prepare a room for you. I thought perhaps we should talk first. I sat up slowly, my head swimming with questions. Richard, I began, unable to approach any other topic until I knew. Was he, your son, Pierre said gently, came to find me 6 months ago. He had discovered some medical anomalies during a routine physical that led him to question his paternity. Through one of those DNA ancestry services and some skilled private investigators, he traced a genetic connection to me. So it's true, I whispered, the confirmation of what I had already guessed hitting me with surprising force. Richard was your son. Pierre nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. Biologically, yes, but in every way that truly matters, he was raised by you and... He hesitated. Your husband. Thomas died 5 years ago, I said automatically. He never knew. I never told him that Richard wasn't his. Richard explained that. Pierre rose, moving to a sideboard where he poured 2 glasses of amber liquid. He said Thomas Thompson was a good father to him. He was, I confirmed, accepting the glass Pierre offered. The cognac burned pleasantly as I took a small sip. He loved Richard as his own. We married quickly after I returned from Paris, and Richard was born 7 months later. Everyone assumed he was premature, but you knew. There was no accusation in Pierre's tone, only a deep sadness. You knew he was mine, yet you never tried to find me. The unfairness of this struck me like a slap. Find you? I thought you were dead, Pierre. After the accident, your roommate told me you died in the hospital. I was 20 years old, pregnant, alone in a foreign country. What was I supposed to do? Pierre went very still. What accident, Eleanor? The genuine confusion in his voice sent a chill through me. The motorcycle accident. 2 days before I left Paris. You were supposed to meet me at the cafe near the Sorbonne, but you never showed. I went to your apartment, and your roommate, Jean something, told me you'd been in a terrible crash, that you'd died from your injuries. There was no accident, Pierre said slowly, his expression darkening. I was at the cafe at the exact time we had arranged. You never came. I waited for hours. When I went to your pension, they said you had checked out that morning, left for America without a word. We stared at each other across 40 years of misunderstanding, the truth dawning with horrible clarity. Jean-Luc, Pierre spoke the name like a curse. He was in love with you, though you never noticed. When I went to Marseille to visit my dying grandmother that weekend, he must have... He shook his head, as if still unable to believe such betrayal possible. He told you I was dead? And told you I had abandoned you, I finished, the pieces falling into place. But why would he? To punish us both, I imagine, Pierre said grimly. He wanted you, but you chose me. Rather than accept that, he made sure neither of us could have the other. The enormity of it was almost too much to comprehend. A jealous young man's lie had altered the course of 3 lives, mine, Pierre's, and most tragically Richard's, who had grown up never knowing his true father. All these years, I whispered, tears filling my eyes. All these years lost because of a lie. Pierre moved to sit beside me on the sofa, close but not touching. When Richard found me, I didn't believe him at first. It seemed impossible. But then he showed me your picture, and it was like seeing a ghost. You looked so much like the Eleanor I remembered, just elegantly matured. He smiled faintly. And Richard, he had my mother's eyes, my father's chin. Once I saw him, I knew he was telling the truth. Why didn't he tell me he'd found you? I asked, the hurt fresh amid so many other emotions. Why keep it secret? Pierre's expression grew troubled. He wanted to, initially, but then he discovered something that changed his plans, something about his wife. Amanda, I said, the name tasting bitter on my tongue. Yes, he hired investigators to confirm his parentage, but they uncovered something else entirely. Evidence that Amanda was having an affair with his business partner, Julian. Worse, they found financial irregularities suggesting the two were embezzling from Thompson Technologies, planning to eventually force Richard out of his own company. Julian, the man who had sat beside Amanda at the will reading, his hand on her knee in that proprietary way. The pieces were beginning to align into a pattern I didn't want to recognize. Richard's death, I said, my voice hollow. The boating accident. You don't believe it was an accident at all, do you? Pierre's silence was answer enough. Pierre's silence confirmed my worst fears, crashing over me in waves of horror. Richard's death, which I'd been trying to accept as a tragic accident, might have been something far more sinister. The police said he fell overboard, I managed, my voice barely above a whisper, that he'd been drinking. Richard never drank when sailing, Pierre said, echoing my own thoughts from the funeral. Never. He was meticulous about safety on the water. It was one of the first things he told me about himself. My hands began to tremble so violently that Pierre gently took the cognac glass from me before it could spill. Are you suggesting that Amanda, that she might have... I don't know, Pierre admitted, his face grave. But Richard was afraid. The last time I spoke with him, 3 days before his death, he told me he was gathering evidence against Amanda and Julian, that he had discovered transfers of company funds to offshore accounts, that he planned to confront them once he had everything documented. And then he died. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. And then he died, Pierre confirmed, out on the water, alone, which Richard told me he never did. He always took a crew member or friend for safety. I pressed my hands to my face, trying to hold myself together as this new reality threatened to shatter me completely. My son, my brilliant, kind-hearted son, might have been murdered by his own wife for money. The same wife who now controlled his entire fortune, who had mocked me at his funeral, who had already been openly flaunting her relationship with Julian mere hours after we put Richard in the ground. Why didn't he go to the police? I asked, dropping my hands to look at Pierre. If he had evidence of embezzlement? He wanted irrefutable proof first, and Pierre hesitated. He was embarrassed, I think, ashamed that he had been so thoroughly deceived by a woman he thought loved him. That, at least, made painful sense. Richard had always been private about his emotions, reluctant to show vulnerability. It was a trait he had inherited from his father, his real father, sitting before me now with the same guarded expression I had seen so often on my son's face. The ticket, I said suddenly, remembering the envelope that had brought me here. Richard's will. He planned this, didn't he? He knew something might happen to him. Pierre nodded, rising to retrieve a folder from his desk. Richard came to me 4 months ago, shortly after discovering Amanda's betrayal. He revised his will, leaving everything visible to her. The penthouse, the yacht, the shares everyone knew about. He opened the folder, removing several documents. But he had been more careful with his money than anyone realized. The majority of his actual wealth was hidden in investments, properties, and accounts that Amanda and Julian knew nothing about. He handed me the papers, which I recognized immediately as legal documents. As I scanned them, my breath caught. They detailed a second will, properly executed and notarized, that contradicted everything that had been read at the penthouse. This will left the bulk of Richard's fortune, a staggering amount that dwarfed even the considerable assets Amanda had inherited, to a trust jointly administered by me and Pierre. He created a trap, I whispered, understanding dawning as I read further. He let them think they had everything while actually securing his true legacy beyond their reach, Pierre finished. Richard was brilliant, Eleanor. He knew that if Amanda suspected there was more, she would never stop searching for it. So he created a spectacle. The public will reading, your apparent disinheritance, the mysterious ticket that everyone witnessed you receive. To throw her off the scent, I said, the pieces falling into place. To make her believe she had won, while actually setting in motion his real plan. Pierre's expression softened with pride and grief. The plane ticket was the key. If you used it, if you came to me, it would activate the second will. If you had refused, everything would indeed have gone to Amanda. I thought back to Palmer's cryptic words about future considerations that would be nullified if I declined to use the ticket. It had been a test of sorts. Would I trust Richard one last time, even when it seemed he had betrayed me? But why the secrecy? Why not just tell me about you, about the second will? Richard said you were a terrible liar, Pierre said, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He feared if you knew the truth, Amanda might see it in your eyes, might realize something was amiss. He wanted her to believe absolutely in her victory. The thought of my son planning all this, protecting me even as he faced unimaginable betrayal, ensuring his true legacy would remain secure, brought fresh tears to my eyes. There's more, Pierre said gently, drawing another document from the folder. Richard left this for you. He asked that I give it to you once you arrived. With trembling fingers, I accepted the sealed envelope, recognizing Richard's handwriting immediately. Breaking the seal, I unfolded several pages covered in my son's distinctive script. My dearest Mom, if you're reading this, then two things have happened. I am gone, and you have trusted me one last time by following my unusual final request. I'm sorry for the public charade at the will reading. I needed Amanda to believe she had won completely. I needed her confidence and arrogance to blossom fully, without suspicion that anything lay beyond her grasp. I found Pierre, my real father, through one of those DNA testing services you always refuse to try. I know who my people are, Richard. I don't need a corporation to tell me. Turns out, you were right to be wary, because what I discovered led me down a path I never could have anticipated. At first, I was angry that you had kept the truth from me. That anger led me to seek out Pierre without telling you. But when I found him, when I saw in his face the same features I see in the mirror each day, that anger dissolved into understanding. He told me about Paris, about your whirlwind romance, about the cruel deception that separated you. Neither of you was to blame. I was planning to bring you together, to heal this decades-old wound. But then I discovered what Amanda and Julian were doing. The company funds they were siphoning, the plans they were making to force me out. And suddenly, I needed to be more careful. I needed to protect what I had built, not just for myself, but for you, for Pierre, for the legacy that should have been ours all along. If I die before I can resolve this situation legally, then you must assume the worst. Trust no one except Pierre and Marcel. They know what to do next. The evidence against Amanda and Julian is stored in the blue lacquer box you gave me for my 16th birthday. I've hidden it where only you would think to look. Remember our treasure hunts when I was small? The place where X always marked the spot. I love you, Mom. I'm sorry for any pain this causes you. But know that in finding Pierre, I found a piece of myself I never knew was missing. I hope that in time, you might find the same healing I did. All my love, Richard. I lowered the letter, my vision blurred with tears. He knew, I whispered. He knew something might happen to him. Pierre reached out, hesitantly, and took my hand in his. His skin was warm, the touch achingly familiar, despite the decades between our last contact and now. Richard was trying to protect everyone he loved, he said softly. He spoke of you with such admiration, Eleanor, such love. He wanted us to have a chance to know each other again, not to rekindle what was lost, necessarily, but to heal the wounds caused by that long-ago lie. I looked at our joined hands, then up at Pierre's face. In his features, I could see shadows of Richard, the shape of his eyes, the angle of his jaw, the way his brow furrowed in concentration. My son had found his father, had known him for only 6 brief months, and had still managed to forge a bond strong enough to entrust him with this elaborate plan. The blue lacquer box, I said, wiping my tears with my free hand. I know exactly where he would have hidden it. Where? Pierre asked. X marks the spot, I replied, a faint smile forming despite my grief. The garden bench at the Cape Cod house, under the X-shaped trellis where I taught him to identify constellations. It was our special place, our spot where all treasure hunts ended when he was a child. Pierre's expression sharpened. We need to get to that box before Amanda does. If it contains the evidence Richard gathered against her, she already has the Cape house, I realized with a sinking feeling. It was part of what she inherited. She could find it at any time if she starts going through Richard's things. Then we must move quickly, Pierre said, rising and pulling me gently to my feet. Marcel can have the jet ready within the hour. The jet? I repeated, momentarily disoriented. Richard's other jet, Pierre explained with a small smile. The one Amanda doesn't know about, one of many assets he kept hidden from her. Including, I might add, a significant ownership stake in this vineyard, which now belongs to you and me. The revelation struck me anew. The depth of Richard's planning, the extent of his true wealth, the careful way he had arranged for justice even from beyond the grave. We're going back to America? I asked, still trying to process everything. We're going to get that evidence, Pierre confirmed, his expression hardening with determination. And then, Eleanor, we are going to make sure that the people responsible for our son's death face the consequences of their actions. Our son. The words sent a shiver through me. Grief and recognition, and something like possibility, all tangled together. Whatever came next, I would not face it alone. The same cruel lie that had separated us decades ago had inadvertently brought us back together through the actions of the son neither of us had properly known. As we stepped out of the study, the last rays of sunset illuminated the chateau in golden light, casting our shadows long across the ancient stone floor. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger perhaps, and the painful task of pursuing justice for Richard. But in that moment, with Pierre's hand still holding mine, I felt something I had not expected to find in this remote corner of France. Purpose, and perhaps, someday, peace. The Beaumont private jet was nothing like any aircraft I'd ever flown in before, all buttery leather and gleaming wood with just 8 luxurious seats and a small but elegant sleeping cabin at the rear. As we settled in for takeoff, I found myself marveling at this strange new reality where my son had secretly owned such extravagances, where Pierre Beaumont had become one of France's wealthiest vintners, and where I, plain Eleanor Thompson, high school English teacher turned widow, was suddenly thrust into a world of private jets and international intrigue. The flight to Boston will take about 7 hours, Pierre explained, as Marcel, now revealed as not just a driver, but Pierre's trusted right-hand man for over 30 years, prepared for departure. We should arrive early morning, local time. And then? I asked, still struggling to grasp our hastily assembled plan. Then we drive to Cape Cod as quickly as possible. Pierre's expression was grim. Hopefully, Amanda is still in New York, too busy enjoying her newfound wealth to visit the summer house yet. I nodded, my thoughts racing ahead. The box is hidden in a compartment beneath the garden bench. Richard and I built it together when he was 12, a secret place for his treasures. No one else knows about it. Let's hope it stays that way for a few more hours, Pierre murmured as the jet began to taxi. As we ascended into the darkening sky, I found myself studying Pierre's profile, noting the changes time had wrought on the young man I had once loved so passionately. The years had been kind to him, silver threading through his once black hair, lines etched at the corners of his eyes and mouth that spoke of laughter as much as age. He was still handsome in that distinctly French way that had captivated me as a 20-year-old American abroad. "You're staring," he observed without turning, a hint of amusement in his voice. "I'm sorry," I said, embarrassed to be caught. "It's just surreal, all of it." Now he did turn, his dark eyes meeting mine. Indeed, if someone had told me yesterday that I would be flying to America with Eleanor Mackenzie, Thompson, I corrected automatically. Of course. A shadow passed over his face. Thompson, Richard's father, the man who raised him. The awkwardness of that reality settled between us. Thomas had been a good man, a kind husband, a loving father to Richard. He had known from the beginning that the child wasn't biologically his, but had never once thrown that fact in my face, even during our worst arguments. He had simply loved Richard as his own, proud of every accomplishment, supportive through every struggle. Thomas was a high school science teacher, I said, feeling a sudden need to acknowledge the man who had been my partner for over 30 years. He loved Richard completely, never once made him feel anything less than wholly wanted, wholly loved. Pierre nodded, his expression softening. Richard spoke highly of him, said he was patient, encouraging, that he never pushed too hard but always believed Richard could achieve whatever he set his mind to. That was Thomas, I agreed, my throat tight with unexpected emotion. He was a good man. And you? Pierre asked quietly. Were you happy with him, Eleanor? The question caught me off guard with its directness. We had a good marriage, comfortable, kind. We were partners, friends. I hesitated, then decided that after 40 years I owed him honesty. We were not what you and I were to each other, but few people ever experience that kind of passion. And passion doesn't always build a stable life. No, Pierre agreed, a hint of sadness in his smile. It does not, though I would have tried, had I known you were carrying my child. The weight of what might have been hung between us, a life together, raising Richard as a family, perhaps other children, a different path entirely from the ones we had walked separately. And you? I asked, turning the question back to him. Did you ever marry? No. Pierre looked out at the darkening clouds below us. There were relationships, of course, some lasting several years, but marriage, it never felt right. He paused, then added so quietly I almost didn't hear, they were never you. Before I could respond to this startling admission, Marcel appeared from the cockpit. We have a secure call from Mr. Palmer, he announced, handing Pierre a satellite phone. He says it's urgent. Pierre took the phone, switching to speakerphone so I could hear. Jeffrey? We're on a secure line. Eleanor is with me. Thank God. Palmer's voice came through clearly despite the distance. You need to accelerate your plans. Amanda and Julian were at the office today, attempting to access Richard's private server. When they couldn't, they became agitated. I overheard them mention the Cape House, saying they needed to check the obvious places first. My blood ran cold. They're looking for something. They suspect Richard had evidence against them. It appears so, Palmer confirmed. And they've already left for Cape Cod. They took the helicopter about 3 hours ago. Pierre and I exchanged alarmed looks. We're still at least 6 hours from Boston, he said, calculating rapidly. Plus another 2 hours to the Cape, even driving at top speed. They'll beat us there, I realized, despair washing through me. They'll find the box. Maybe not, Pierre said, his mind clearly racing. Jeffrey, can you send someone to the house? Create a delay of some kind? I've already dispatched the caretaker with instructions to report a water leak. Shut off the main supply. It should buy you a few hours while plumbers are called, but not much more than that. It will have to do, Pierre decided. We'll call when we land. After ending the call, Pierre instructed Marcel to request permission to increase our speed, fuel considerations be damned. Then he turned back to me, determination etched in his features. We'll make it, Eleanor. I promise you. I wished I could share his confidence, but dread had settled in my stomach like a stone. If Amanda and Julian found Richard's evidence before we could reach it, not only would justice for our son be compromised, but Pierre and I might find ourselves in danger as well. People willing to murder for millions would certainly not hesitate to eliminate 2 more obstacles. What if, I began, then faltered, the thought too terrible to voice. What if they find it first? Pierre finished for me, reading my fear. Then we moved to contingency plans. Richard was thorough, Eleanor. He wouldn't have placed all his evidence in one location. How can you be so sure? I asked. You only knew him for 6 months. Pierre's expression softened. Because he was my son. And apparently, he inherited my tendency to prepare for all possibilities. He reached across the aisle separating our seats and took my hand. And because he was your son, which means he was both brilliant and meticulous. The simple confidence in his words steadied me. He was right. Richard had never been careless, even as a child. If he had gone to the trouble of creating a second secret will, of bringing Pierre and me together, of arranging this elaborate posthumous plan, then he would have safeguarded the evidence in multiple ways. I wish I'd known, I said suddenly, the regret overwhelming me, about you being alive, about Richard finding you. I wish I could have seen you together, even once. Pierre's fingers tightened around mine. He recorded our first meeting, he said quietly. Set up his phone on the table between us, said he wanted to document the moment. I have it saved. When this is over, When Richard has justice, I'll show you. The thought of seeing that moment, my son meeting his biological father for the first time, brought fresh tears to my eyes. What had Richard felt, coming face to face with the man whose features he bore? What had Pierre experienced, suddenly confronted with the adult son he never knew existed? So much lost time, so many stolen moments, and at the center of it all, the cruel lie told by a jealous young man 4 decades ago that had altered the course of all our lives. We should rest, Pierre suggested gently. The confrontation ahead may require all our strength. He was right, though I doubted sleep would come easily with my mind racing. Still, I reclined my seat and closed my eyes, Richard's letter tucked securely in my pocket. Whatever awaited us at the Cape House, I would face it for my son, for the truth, for the justice he had carefully planned, but not lived to see executed. And perhaps, I admitted to myself, as exhaustion finally pulled me toward unconsciousness, for the chance to discover what might still exist between me and the man who had been my first love, the man who was now my unexpected ally in this strangest of journeys. Boston greeted us with a dreary dawn, low clouds, persistent drizzle, and a chill that seeped through my jacket as we descended the stairs from Pierre's jet. A sleek black SUV waited on the tarmac, the driver holding an umbrella and a grim expression. "Mr. Beaumont," he nodded as we approached. "Mrs. Thompson, we need to hurry." Inside the vehicle, the driver, who introduced himself only as Roberts, brought us up to speed as we navigated the early morning traffic out of the city. "Mr. Palmer called again 30 minutes ago. The plumbing diversion bought you some time, but Amanda and Julian arrived at the Cape House 4 hours ago. They dismissed the caretaker once the water issue was resolved. Have they found anything?" Pierre asked sharply. Roberts shook his head. "Unknown. The security system Richard installed allows us to monitor the property's perimeter, but not the interior. We know they're still there, but not what they're doing." I closed my eyes briefly, picturing the Cape Cod house where Richard and I had spent so many summers. It was smaller than the Manhattan penthouse, more modest in its luxury, but infinitely more personal. Richard had loved that house. The weathered cedar shingles, the wide deck overlooking the water, the garden where we had spent countless hours together. "They'll search the house first," I said with certainty. "Richard's office, his bedroom. They won't think to check the garden until they've exhausted the obvious places. Then we may still have time," Pierre observed, checking his watch. "How much longer until we arrive?" "About 90 minutes in this traffic," Roberts replied, maneuvering skillfully through the congested highway. "Less, if it clears." Pierre nodded, then turned to me. "We should prepare for all possibilities, Eleanor. If Amanda and Julian are there when we arrive, what is our approach?" I hadn't considered this. In my mind, we would somehow slip in unnoticed, retrieve the box, and escape with the evidence. The reality of potentially confronting my daughter-in-law and her lover, my son's possible murderers, sent a shiver down my spine. "I don't know," I admitted. I'm a retired English teacher, Pierre. I don't know how to confront murderers." His hand covered mine briefly. "You are much more than that. You are Richard's mother. You are stronger than you know." He turned to Roberts. "We need a distraction if they're still present. Something to draw them away from the property temporarily." Roberts nodded. "Already arranged. A delivery of mistakenly addressed furniture is scheduled to arrive at the neighboring house at precisely noon. They'll make enough of a commotion about the confusion that anyone nearby will be drawn to investigate." I marveled at the efficiency of this operation, the private jet, the waiting car, the planned distraction. Had Richard arranged all this, anticipating every contingency? Or was this Pierre's doing, evidence of the resources at his disposal? As we drove, the cityscape gradually gave way to smaller towns, then to the coastal landscape of Cape Cod. Familiar landmarks appeared. The ice cream shop where Richard had spent his allowance every Saturday, the bookstore where I had bought him his first astronomy guide, the marina where he had learned to sail. Richard was everywhere here, his presence lingering in my memories of summers past, and now he was gone. His life cut short by betrayal, I still struggled to fully comprehend. "Eleanor," Pierre's voice drew me from my thoughts. "Before we arrive, there's something you should know." His expression was troubled. "Marcel received a call from our contacts in France while you were sleeping on the plane. They've been monitoring Amanda's financial transactions as Richard requested." "And?" Large sums have been moving from Richard's accounts, the ones Amanda now controls, to offshore destinations. But more concerning is this. He handed me a tablet displaying what appeared to be a property listing. She's put the Manhattan penthouse on the market, the Cape House as well. She's liquidating everything as quickly as possible. She's planning to run, I realized. Once she has everything converted to cash, she and Julian could disappear, Pierre confirmed, which suggests they are indeed guilty of what Richard suspected. My grief crystallized into something harder, more focused. This woman had not only potentially murdered my son, but was now erasing every trace of his life, converting his legacy into untraceable funds. The thought was unbearable. We need to stop her, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. Not just for justice, but for Richard. Pierre nodded, something like approval flickering in his eyes. Yes, for Richard. As we approached the turnoff to the private road leading to the summer house, Robert slowed the SUV, pulling onto a concealed side path. Their vehicle is still on the property, he reported, checking a small device. We'll wait here until the distraction arrives, then proceed on foot through the back path. The back path was a narrow trail through the dunes that led directly to the garden, a route Richard and I had often taken for our early morning walks to the beach. That it would now serve as our covert approach to retrieve evidence against my son's killers seemed like a terrible perversion of those innocent memories. At precisely noon, Roberts received a notification on his phone. The delivery is arriving now. Get ready. From our position, we could just see the neighboring property, where a large truck had pulled up. Men in uniform began unloading a substantial amount of furniture, arguing loudly with the confused homeowner. As predicted, the commotion soon drew attention from our target house. Through binoculars, Roberts confirmed that both Amanda and Julian had emerged onto the deck to watch the spectacle unfolding next door. Now, he said simply. Pierre and I slipped from the SUV, following Roberts down the familiar sandy path that wound through beach grass and scraggly pines. The rain had tapered to a fine mist, but the ground was still damp, our footsteps thankfully silent on the soft terrain. When the house came into view, my heart clenched at the sight of it. So unchanged outwardly, yet now the scene of a frantic search for evidence by the very people who had betrayed Richard. We crouched behind a dune, watching as Amanda and Julian stood on the deck, pointing and conversing about the noisy delivery next door. They'll be distracted for 10 minutes at most, Roberts warned. We need to move quickly. I led the way around the perimeter of the property to the garden at the far side, a secluded space enclosed by tall hedges that blocked the view from both the house and neighboring properties. In the center stood the wrought iron bench, beneath an X-shaped trellis covered in climbing roses, our special place, where Richard and I had spent countless evenings stargazing. There, I whispered, pointing to the bench. The compartment is built into the concrete base. You have to press the third rose detail from the left to release the mechanism. Pierre nodded, and we crept forward, constantly glancing toward the house. The garden was mercifully empty, though signs of recent disturbance, trampled flowers, a displaced garden gnome, suggested Amanda and Julian had already begun searching here. Kneeling beside the bench, I located the decorative iron rose on the base, an embellishment that looked purely ornamental but was actually an intricate latch. I pressed it firmly, hearing the satisfying click as the hidden compartment released. A small drawer slid outward from the concrete, revealing the blue lacquer box, exactly where Richard had promised it would be. You found it, Pierre breathed, relief evident in his voice. They haven't discovered the hiding place, I confirmed, carefully lifting the box. It was heavier than I remembered, about the size of a thick novel, its surface still pristine, despite years in the concealed compartment. We need to go, Roberts urged, his attention fixed on the house. They're coming back inside. Clutching the box to my chest, I rose to my feet, only to freeze at the unmistakable sound of the garden gate latch opening behind us. Well, Amanda's cold voice sliced through the misty air. Look who decided to join us after all. I turned slowly, the blue lacquer box still clutched against my chest. Amanda stood at the garden gate, Julian just behind her. The designer funeral outfit was gone, replaced by casual luxury. Cashmere sweater, tailored jeans, boots that probably cost more than my monthly pension. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a sleek ponytail, her expression one of amused surprise. Eleanor, she drawled, stepping fully into the garden. What a delightful surprise. And you've brought friends. Her eyes flicked to Pierre, then to Robert's, narrowing slightly. Breaking and entering is a serious crime, you know, especially when the property belongs to me. This house belonged to Richard, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. A place he loved, a place where he was happy. And now it belongs to me, Amanda replied with a tight smile, along with everything else Richard owned. Funny how inheritance works, isn't it? Julian moved to stand beside her, his hand resting casually in the pocket of his expensive jacket, a posture that somehow seemed more threatening than casual. He was taller than I remembered from the funeral, his features handsome in a predatory way that made my skin crawl. "What's in the box, Eleanor?" he asked, his voice deceptively gentle. "Something valuable, I assume, given your clandestine little expedition to retrieve it." Pierre shifted subtly, positioning himself between me and the couple. "Mrs. Thompson was retrieving personal items left to her by her son," he said, his accent more pronounced under stress. "Items specifically excluded from the main estate." Amanda laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "And who exactly are you? Eleanor's gentleman friend." "I didn't realize nursing homes allowed day trips for dating purposes. My name is Pierre Beaumont," he replied, with dignity. "I am Richard's father." The statement landed like a physical blow. Amanda's carefully cultivated expression of mocking superiority faltered, genuine shock replacing it momentarily. "That's impossible," she snapped, recovering quickly. "Richard's father died years ago, Thomas something or other. Thomas Thompson was the man who raised me." A new voice spoke from behind them, causing Amanda and Julian to spin around. "But he wasn't my biological father." Richard stood in the garden doorway, very much alive. My knees nearly buckled. The box slipped from my suddenly nerveless fingers, only Pierre's quick reflexes preventing it from crashing to the ground. I stared at the apparition before me. My son, whom I had buried barely a week ago, now standing just feet away, alive and unharmed. "Richard?" I whispered, unable to trust my eyes, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. "Hello, Mom," he said, his familiar smile tinged with sadness. "I'm so sorry for what I put you through. It was the only way." Amanda had gone deathly pale, one hand gripping Julian's arm as if to steady herself. This is impossible. You're dead." "We saw your body." "Did you?" Richard asked, stepping fully into the garden. "Or did you see a body that was identified as mine after spending 2 days in the ocean? A body that required a closed casket funeral due to the condition of the remains?" Julian's hand moved from his pocket, and I glimpsed the metallic gleam of a gun before Robert smoothly intercepted, disarming him with a quick professional movement that spoke of specialized training. "I wouldn't," Robert said quietly, securing the weapon. "The property is currently surrounded by federal agents. This conversation is being recorded as evidence." My mind was still struggling to process Richard's resurrection as he crossed the garden to embrace me. He felt solid, real, his familiar scent enveloping me as he held me tightly. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he murmured against my hair. "I couldn't tell you. It wasn't safe. I needed everyone to believe I was really dead, especially Amanda and Julian. Their reaction to my death was the final evidence we needed." "I don't understand," I said, pulling back to search his face, the face I thought I would never see again in this life. The funeral, the body, an unfortunate John Doe who matched my general description, Richard explained grimly. "Found 2 days after I supposedly went overboard. The medical examiner was part of the operation. She falsified the identification, listing it as confirmed through dental records." "Operation?" I repeated, still dazed. Pierre placed a steadying hand on my shoulder. "Richard contacted me 6 months ago, as I told you. What I didn't tell you was that after confirming I was his biological father, he shared his suspicions about Amanda and Julian. Together, we took those suspicions to the FBI. I turned to look at Amanda, who had recovered her composure and now regarded us with cold fury. "You were investigating them? All this time?" "For nearly 4 months," Richard confirmed. "After I accidentally discovered irregularities in the company accounts, transfers that I hadn't authorized, contracts with shell companies that led back to Julian's offshore holdings. When I dug deeper, I found communications between them, discussing how to force me out of my own company." His expression hardened. "And eventually, when that proved too difficult, how to eliminate me entirely." "You have no proof of any of this," Amanda hissed, her beautiful face contorted with hatred. "Nothing that would stand up in court." Richard smiled thinly. That's where you're wrong. The blue lacquer box my mother just retrieved contains USB drives with copies of every incriminating email, text, and financial transaction. But more importantly, it contains the listening devices I planted throughout our home after discovering your affair with Julian. Devices that recorded your explicit discussions about having me killed. That's illegal surveillance, Julian snapped, his lawyer's instincts emerging even in crisis. Inadmissible. Perhaps in a normal criminal proceeding? Agreed a new voice as a distinguished older man in a suit entered the garden. But when it's part of an authorized FBI operation investigating corporate espionage and conspiracy to commit murder, the rules are somewhat different. Special Agent Donovan, Richard introduced him. The lead on my case. Amanda's perfect poise finally shattered completely. This is ridiculous. You faked your own death to frame us? No one will believe this insane story. They'll believe the evidence, Agent Donovan replied calmly, which is substantial and growing more damning by the day. Your reactions to Richard's death have been particularly illuminating. The speed with which you moved to liquidate assets, the offshore transfers, the expedited sale listings for the properties, not the actions of a grieving widow. As if on cue, additional agents appeared, formally placing Amanda and Julian under arrest. I watched in stunned silence as they were led away, Amanda's furious accusations fading as they exited the garden. Left alone with Richard and Pierre, I found myself trembling. The accumulated shock, relief, confusion, and exhaustion of the past week crashing over me at once. Richard guided me to the bench, sitting beside me while Pierre stood protectively nearby. I know this is overwhelming, Richard said gently, and I can't begin to apologize enough for putting you through the pain of believing I was dead. But I needed everyone to believe it, truly believe it. If Amanda had suspected I was alive, she would have disappeared with everything she could liquidate before we could build a case against her. The will, I said, pieces starting to fall into place. The public reading, the envelope, sending me to France. It was all part of this plan? Richard nodded. I needed to get you safely away from Amanda while creating the impression that you'd been disinherited. If she thought you had nothing, that you posed no threat, she wouldn't bother with you. And I needed you to find Pierre, to understand the full truth about your past, about mine. I looked up at Pierre, who had been watching us with an expression of profound emotion. You knew Richard was alive all this time? Yes, he admitted. It was difficult to maintain the deception with you, Eleanor, but necessary for Richard's safety. And the box? I asked, turning back to Richard. Was it really necessary, or just another part of the charade? Both, Richard replied. It contains actual evidence, but we already had copies. What we needed was to catch Amanda and Julian in the act of searching for it, further proof of their guilt. They've been tearing the house apart for days looking for anything incriminating I might have left behind. It was almost too much to process. The elaborate deception, the international operation, my son alive after I had mourned him so deeply. And yet, beneath the confusion and lingering hurt of being kept in the dark, a profound relief was taking root. Richard was alive. Nothing else mattered as much as that miraculous fact. I have so many questions, I said, reaching up to touch his face, reassuring myself of his solidity. I know, he acknowledged, and I promise to answer all of them. But first, he glanced at Pierre, some unspoken communication passing between them. I think it's time the three of us had a proper conversation about the past, about the future, about the time we've lost and the time we might still have together. As the agents completed their work around us, securing the property and collecting final evidence, I sat between the two men who shared the same distinctive eyes, the same determined set to their jaw. My son and his father both returned to me from what I had believed was permanent loss. Outside the garden walls, justice was finally unfolding for those who had conspired against Richard. But here, in this small sanctuary where I had once taught my son to identify constellations, something else was beginning. The careful, tentative reconstruction of a family fractured 40 years ago by a single malicious lie. We moved from the garden to the house once the agents had finished securing evidence and escorting Amanda and Julian away. The Cape House, a place filled with so many memories, felt different now, transformed by recent events into something both familiar and strange. Richard led us to the sunroom overlooking the water, where the three of us sat in awkward silence for several moments, the weight of our shared history and separate pasts hanging between us. "I don't know where to begin," I finally said, looking from Richard to Pierre and back again. "I buried you. I mourned you. And all this time—" "I know, Mom." Richard reached for my hand. "Asking you to endure that grief was the hardest part of this whole operation. If there had been any other way—" "Was there?" I interrupted, needing to understand. "Was there truly no other option?" Richard exchanged glances with Pierre before answering. "We considered alternatives for weeks, but Amanda and Julian were careful. They used encrypted communications, offshore accounts, cutouts for their most damning conversations. We needed something dramatic to force them into the open, to make them believe they'd succeeded so they would become careless. And my supposed death was the only lever powerful enough," he continued. "Once they believed I was gone, they started moving quickly to secure assets, liquidate properties, transfer funds, all actions that created a paper trail we could follow." Pierre leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Eleanor, Richard fought against this plan initially. He was deeply concerned about the pain it would cause you. It was Agent Donovan who suggested including you in the aftermath operation," Richard explained. "He felt that sending you to Pierre would serve multiple purposes, getting you safely away from Amanda, who might have seen you as a potential threat if you started asking questions, while also giving us the opportunity to reunite you with Pierre after all these years. So, the will reading, the envelope, the plane ticket, all theater for Amanda's benefit?" Richard nodded. "We needed to create a public perception that you had been disinherited, left with nothing but a mysterious ticket. It made you appear harmless to Amanda's plans, while actually setting our real plan in motion." I took a deep breath, trying to process everything. The relief of finding Richard alive warred with the hurt of being kept in the dark, of enduring unnecessary grief. "The body," I said suddenly, a disturbing thought occurring to me. "You said it was a John Doe. Someone's son is in your grave, Richard. Someone who deserves to be recognized, to be mourned by their own family." Richard's expression softened. "There is no body, Mom. The casket was weighted, but empty. Once this operation is complete, we'll discover that a mistake was made in the identification. The medical examiner's falsified report will be corrected. No one is missing their chance to properly bury a loved one." This, at least, was a relief. The thought of another mother being denied the chance to mourn her son properly had been momentarily unbearable. "So what happens now?" I asked, looking between them. "Now," Pierre said gently, "we have choices to make. All of us." Richard stood, moving to the window to look out at the ocean. "Legally, I'll remain dead until the case against Amanda and Julian is fully prepared. That could be weeks, possibly months. My resurrection will be explained as part of a federal witness protection operation, which is essentially what it has been. And after that," I pressed, "after that?" He turned back to face us. "I don't know exactly. Thompson Technologies will need restructuring. Many of the board members were complicit in Julian's scheme, or at least willfully ignorant. The properties can be reclaimed, the assets frozen during the investigation, unfrozen." He hesitated, then continued more softly. "But more importantly, I think the three of us have 40 years of lost time to consider. Connections to rebuild or build for the first time, if that's what you both want." Pierre and I exchanged glances, decades of separation and misunderstanding stretching between us like a chasm that suddenly seemed both vast and crossable. "I would like that," Pierre said simply. "I have lived most of my life with a space where family should have been. To discover not only that Eleanor survived, but that I had a son. It has been transformative. However complicated, however difficult the path forward might be, I want to walk it." They both looked at me, waiting. My heart felt too full, torn between joy at Richard's resurrection and uncertainty about what Pierre's reappearance in my life might mean. "I need time," I admitted. "This is overwhelming. A week ago, I was a grieving mother planning the rest of my life alone. Now my son is alive. My past has resurfaced in ways I never imagined possible, and everything I thought I knew has been upended." "Of course," Richard said quickly. "There's no rush, no pressure. But," I continued, finding my way to the truth as I spoke, "I would also like to try, to see what might be possible now between all of us." Relief washed over both their faces, so similar in expression that it struck me anew how clearly Richard had inherited Pierre's features. his mannerisms. How had I not seen it before, this clear reflection of his biological father? Perhaps, Pierre suggested carefully, we might begin simply, with stories. There are 40 years to account for after all. And so we did. As afternoon faded into evening, we remained in that sunroom, sharing the lives we had lived separately. Pierre told us of building his vineyard from nearly nothing, of the early struggles and eventual success. I spoke of raising Richard, of teaching high school English, of my life with Thomas. And Richard filled in the gaps of his own life, the parts I had witnessed but not fully understood. The recent years when his business success had led him to Amanda and ultimately to the discovery of his true paternity. Somewhere in those hours of conversation, the awkwardness began to dissolve. We ordered takeout from the local seafood restaurant Richard and I had frequented during our summers here, eating from cardboard containers while continuing to talk. Agent Donovan called twice with updates. Amanda and Julian were securely in custody. The evidence from the blue lacquer box was being processed. The case was proceeding smoothly. As night fell, Richard excused himself to take a longer call from the FBI, leaving Pierre and me alone for the first time since the shocking revelation in the garden. "This is not how I imagined our reunion," Pierre said softly after a moment of silence. "In all my fantasies over the years, and there were many, I never pictured anything like this. You imagined reuniting with me?" I couldn't hide my surprise. "After all this time?" He smiled, the expression transforming his face to one I recognized from my memories. "Eleanor, I never stopped hoping I might find you again someday. I searched in the early years, but Eleanor Mackenzie seemed to have vanished from the face of the earth. Because she became Eleanor Thompson, I realized, and I never used social media, never had much of a public presence. A ghost I couldn't find," Pierre agreed, "until our son brought us together again. Our son." The words still sounded strange, miraculous. Richard was Pierre's son, a truth hidden for decades, but now undeniable as I looked at the two of them together. "What do you want from this, Pierre?" I asked directly. "From me? From Richard? From this unexpected second chance?" He considered the question seriously. "I want whatever is possible, Eleanor. Whatever you and Richard are willing to share. I have no expectations, no demands, only gratitude for this opportunity. However it unfolds." His humility touched me. The passionate young man I had loved had grown into a thoughtful, patient adult who understood that relationships couldn't be forced, that trust and connection required time. "One day at a time, then," I suggested, offering a tentative smile. "One day at a time," he agreed, returning the smile with one of his own. Outside, waves crashed against the shore in the familiar rhythm that had been the soundtrack to so many summers here. Inside, three people connected by blood and circumstance began the delicate process of becoming something like a family. Unusual, unexpected, but perhaps all the more precious for the long journey that had brought us to this point. The next morning dawned clear and bright. The storm that had accompanied our arrival completely dissipated. I woke early, disoriented momentarily by the unfamiliar bedroom until I remembered where I was. The Cape House, Richard alive. Pierre returned from the past. Everything changed in ways I was still struggling to comprehend. I found myself drawn to the kitchen, where decades of habit led me to put on coffee and look for the ingredients to make Richard's favorite breakfast, blueberry pancakes, a tradition from his childhood summers here. The simple, familiar task grounded me amid the swirling uncertainty of everything else. "Some things never change." Richard's voice came from the doorway, startling me. First morning at the Cape House, Mom makes pancakes. I turned to find my son, alive, whole, smiling, leaning against the doorframe. The sight still seemed miraculous, impossible. I wasn't sure what else to do, I admitted. Normal seems in short supply right now. He crossed the room to hug me, and I held on perhaps a moment longer than necessary, still needing the physical reassurance of his presence. "I'm sorry," he said as we separated, "for everything you went through. Agent Donovan showed me the footage from the funeral. Seeing you there, believing I was gone," his voice cracked slightly. "It was harder than I expected." "They recorded the funeral?" "Part of building the case. They needed to document Amanda's behavior, her interactions with Julian. The thought of federal agents surveilling my grief felt invasive, unsettling. This whole operation, it's been planned for months, hasn't it? While I knew nothing." Richard nodded, taking a seat at the counter as I returned to mixing pancake batter. Since January. That's when I first found discrepancies in the company accounts. Small transfers at first, then larger ones. When I traced them back to shell companies connected to Julian, I realized something serious was happening. "Why didn't you come to me?" I asked. The question that had been haunting me since yesterday's revelations. Why keep me in the dark through all of this? "Initially, I planned to," he said, his expression troubled. "But then I discovered something that changed everything." "What?" "That Amanda and Julian had hired someone to monitor you, to track your movements, your phone calls. They were concerned you might notice something off in my behavior as I investigated them." I nearly dropped the mixing bowl. "They were spying on me? But why?" "Because you know me better than anyone," Richard explained. "You've always been able to tell when something's bothering me, when I'm holding something back. They worried you might realize I was suspicious of them, might encourage me to dig deeper. The violation was profound, strangers watching me, tracking my movements, all because Amanda saw me as a potential threat to her schemes. That's when I knew I couldn't bring you in," Richard continued. "It would have put you in danger. If they realized you knew what they were planning." He didn't need to finish the thought. If Amanda and Julian were willing to murder Richard for his money, they wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone else who threatened their plans. "But you brought Pierre in," I noted, unable to keep a hint of hurt from my voice as I poured the first pancakes onto the griddle. Richard had the grace to look uncomfortable. "That was complicated. I found him initially because of the DNA test, before I discovered what Amanda and Julian were planning. Once I did realize the danger, I was already in contact with him, and he was safely in France, beyond their reach or awareness." "You trusted him immediately? A stranger?" "Not immediately, no." Richard smiled faintly. "But there was something about him, something familiar in a way I couldn't explain at first. And he had resources, connections that proved valuable to the operation. The private jet, secure communications, trusted personnel like Marcel and Roberts. As if summoned by his name, Pierre appeared in the kitchen doorway, hesitating as if uncertain of his welcome in this domestic scene. "Good morning," he said, his accent more pronounced with sleep. "I hope I'm not intruding?" "Not at all," I replied, gesturing to the coffee pot. "Help yourself. I'm making pancakes." "A tradition, Richard tells me," Pierre said as he poured himself a cup. "One of many I have missed." The simple acknowledgement of all he had missed, all we had both missed through our decades of separation, hung in the air between us. "There will be new traditions," Richard suggested carefully. "Different ones perhaps, but still meaningful." Pierre nodded, taking a seat beside Richard at the counter. The resemblance between them was even more striking in the morning light. The same profile, the same way of holding their coffee cups, the same thoughtful pause before speaking. "Agent Donovan called," Pierre informed us. "Amanda and Julian are being formally charged today. The evidence from the blue lacquer box has been analyzed and appears quite damning. Recordings of them explicitly discussing plans to eliminate Richard, financial documentation of the stolen funds, even communications with the person they hired to sabotage the yacht." "They actually hired someone?" I asked, horrified anew at the calculated nature of their plan. Richard nodded grimly. "A mechanic who created what would have appeared to be an accidental equipment failure if I had actually taken the yacht out that day. The FBI intercepted him before he could complete the job and convinced him to cooperate." "So you never were in danger on the water," I realized, flipping the pancakes perhaps more forcefully than necessary. "No," Richard confirmed, though the plan to fake my death was real. We needed Amanda and Julian to believe they had succeeded in order to gather the final evidence against them. I began plating the pancakes, the familiar ritual at odds with the extraordinary conversation. "And now? How long before you can officially return from the dead?" "A few weeks, most likely," Richard replied. "There are legal considerations, protocols for witness protection cases, and we need to ensure the charges against Amanda and Julian are fully secured before I emerge." "And in the meantime?" I asked, setting plates before them both. "In the meantime," Pierre said carefully, "I was hoping you might consider visiting Chateau Beaumont again, both of you. There is much of Richard's heritage, his French heritage, that he has yet to discover. And perhaps," he hesitated, then continued with deliberate casualness, "perhaps it might be a good place for all of us to become better acquainted, away from the complications here." The invitation hung in the air, not just a suggestion for a visit, but an opening to something more, a chance to explore what might still exist between Pierre and me, after all these years. An opportunity for Richard to connect with his biological father's world, his history, his legacy. I'd like that, Richard said, looking between us. Once the immediate legal matters are settled, the vineyard was extraordinary. I'd like to see more of it, understand more about that part of my history. They both looked at me, waiting. I busied myself with the remaining pancake batter, buying time to consider. The thought of returning to France, of spending extended time with Pierre at his chateau, brought a complex mixture of feelings: anticipation, anxiety, a flutter of something that felt dangerously like hope. "I'll think about it," I said finally, not ready to commit but unwilling to refuse outright. "There's still so much to process here first." Pierre nodded, accepting my hesitation without pressing. "Of course, there is no rush, Eleanor. Only an open invitation, whenever you might wish to accept it." As we ate breakfast together, this strange new family unit formed from decades-old secrets and recent revelations, I found myself studying both men surreptitiously. My son, whom I had raised and loved for 38 years, his father, whom I had loved briefly but intensely in my youth. The connections between them were unmistakable now that I knew to look for them, genetic echoes that had always been there, unrecognized until now. Whatever came next, whether a visit to France, a gradual rebuilding of relationships, or paths that ultimately diverged again, at least it would be founded on truth rather than lies. The deception that had separated Pierre and me 40 years ago, and the more recent deceptions orchestrated by Amanda and Julian, would no longer shape our lives. For now, that knowledge, and the miraculous reality of Richard alive across the table, was enough. 3 weeks passed in a strange limbo. Richard remained officially dead, while the case against Amanda and Julian solidified. The evidence from the blue lacquer box proved even more damning than anticipated. Not only recordings of their explicit plans to murder Richard, but documentation of systematic embezzlement stretching back nearly 2 years. Agent Donovan kept us updated on the proceedings, which moved with surprising speed once Amanda's carefully constructed facade cracked under interrogation. Faced with the overwhelming evidence against her, she turned on Julian, offering testimony in exchange for a reduced sentence. Julian, in turn, implicated several board members who had knowingly assisted in the financial fraud. The scandal expanded daily, making headlines in financial papers and eventually mainstream news. Through it all, the three of us remained at the Cape House, sheltered from the media storm by federal agents who maintained a security perimeter around the property. It was a peculiar time, part family reunion, part witness protection, part emotional reckoning as we navigated our complex connections. Pierre and I settled into a cautious friendship, neither of us pushing for more, but both aware of the unresolved feelings that sometimes surfaced in quiet moments. We took long walks on the beach, comparing the lives we had lived separately, filling in 40 years of history in fragmentary conversations that often circled back to Richard. "He has your intelligence," Pierre observed one afternoon, as we watched Richard on a video call with federal prosecutors, his quick mind dissecting complex financial transactions with remarkable clarity. "And your moral compass. He could have simply divorced Amanda when he discovered her affair, walked away with his fortune intact. Instead, he risked everything to ensure justice was served." "He has your determination," I countered. "Once he sets a course, nothing deters him. And your eyes, your hands, even the way you both gesture when explaining something complicated. These moments of shared pride in our son bridge the decades of separation, creating a tentative foundation for whatever might come next." Richard, for his part, seemed to be enjoying this unexpected time with both his parents. He shared stories from his childhood that I had almost forgotten, asked Pierre about family history in France, and occasionally orchestrated situations where Pierre and I found ourselves alone together, his matchmaking intentions transparent, but oddly touching. "You know what he's doing," I said to Pierre one evening after Richard had suddenly remembered an urgent call he needed to make, leaving us alone on the deck with a bottle of wine from the Beaumont vineyard. "Of course," Pierre replied with a small smile. "He is not subtle. Does it bother you?" Pierre considered the question, swirling the ruby liquid in his glass thoughtfully. "That our son wishes to see us happy? No. That he perhaps has overly romantic notions about rekindling a 40-year-old love affair? Perhaps a little. We're different people now," I agreed. The Eleanor and Pierre who fell in love in Paris don't exist anymore. No, they don't, he acknowledged. But perhaps the people we have become might find their own connection, if given the chance. Different, but no less meaningful for being built on experience rather than youthful passion. His directness took me by surprise, though it shouldn't have. Pierre had always possessed a refreshing honesty, an ability to speak truth without artifice. Is that what you want? I asked, equally direct. I want the opportunity to find out, he replied simply. No expectations, no pressure. Just time to discover who we are to each other now, beyond Richard's parents, beyond our shared past. Before I could respond, Richard reappeared, his expression unusually serious. Agent Donovan just called. The prosecutors have reached plea agreements with both Amanda and Julian. The case is essentially closed. What does that mean for you? I asked, sensing the weight behind his announcement. It means, he said, taking a seat between us, that my resurrection has been scheduled for next week, a press conference explaining that my death was staged as part of a federal operation to catch embezzlers and would-be murderers. And after that? Pierre prompted gently. Richard took a deep breath. After that, I need to rebuild. The company will require extensive reorganization. The board will need new members. Trust will need to be restored with investors, clients, employees. He paused, then continued more hesitantly. I've been thinking about what comes next, personally as well, about what matters most after coming so close to losing everything. And what conclusions have you reached? I asked, recognizing the thoughtful expression he wore when making important decisions. That life is too short for missed opportunities and unspoken truths. He looked between us. I've decided to accept Pierre's invitation to spend time at Chateau Beaumont. Not just a visit, but an extended stay, perhaps 6 months. I stared at him, surprised. 6 months? What about the company? I can manage most aspects remotely, with occasional trips back to New York as needed. And frankly, after everything that's happened, some distance from Thompson Technologies might be healthy, for me and for the organization. He took both our hands, creating a physical connection between the three of us. I'd like you to join me, Mom. To come to France, to spend time getting to know the other half of my heritage, to see if there might be a place for you there as well, in whatever capacity feels right. The invitation hung in the air, freighted with meaning beyond the simple words. This wasn't just about a trip to France, about exploring Richard's paternal heritage. It was about the possibility of something new between Pierre and me, something unrushed, unpressured, but potentially profound. You don't need to decide immediately, Pierre added, seeing my hesitation. The invitation remains open, whenever you might feel ready. Later that night, alone in my room, I found myself drawn to the window overlooking the moonlit beach where Richard and I had spent so many summer evenings. The familiar landscape seemed different now, transformed by recent revelations and resurrections. Everything had changed. Richard was not just my son, but Pierre's as well. He carried a heritage I had denied him knowledge of for 38 years, a connection to a culture and family history that was rightfully his to claim. And Pierre was no longer a painful memory of love lost, but a living, breathing man whose life had taken its own path parallel to mine, only to converge again through our son. Could there still be something between us after all this time? Not the rekindling of youthful passion, as Pierre had rightly noted, but something new built on who we had become in the intervening decades. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. As I watched the waves crashing against the shore, I realized that whatever choice I made would irrevocably alter the course of my life. Staying in New York meant returning to the familiar, the comfortable. Going to France meant stepping into the unknown, taking a risk on possibilities that might come to nothing, or might lead to something I hadn't even allowed myself to imagine. The envelope that had started this journey, the plane ticket to Saint-Michel that had seemed like such a cruel joke at the funeral, now represented a choice rather than a command. A choice to explore what might still exist between Pierre and me, what new relationships might form among the three of us as a most unusual family. With sudden clarity, I realized there was really only one choice I could make, the one that honored not just the past we had shared, but the future we might still create together. Decision made, I turned from the window to begin packing for France. The press conference announcing Richard's resurrection was as surreal as the funeral had been. Cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions, the official narrative carefully presented by Agent Donovan with Richard standing solemnly at his side. I watched from a secured room, Pierre beside me, as my son explained to the world that his death had been temporarily falsified as part of an elaborate operation to catch those who had conspired against him. The media frenzy that followed was intense, but mercifully brief. The story of betrayal, fake death, and justice served was irresistible to news outlets, but the legal gag orders surrounding the ongoing prosecutions limited what could be reported. Within days, newer scandals had pushed us from the headlines, allowing a tentative return to something resembling normal life. For Richard, normal now meant extensive meetings with the Thompson Technologies Board, reassuring key clients and restructuring the company leadership. For me, it meant finalizing arrangements for an extended absence, sublet my apartment, notify friends, forward my mail. For Pierre, it meant returning briefly to France to prepare for our arrival, to inform his staff and business partners that he would be hosting his son and his son's mother for an extended visit. "Are you sure about this?" Richard asked the night before our departure, finding me on the deck of the Cape House where I sat watching the sunset one last time. 6 months is a long commitment. "I'm sure," I replied, surprising myself with how true it felt. I spent 40 years wondering what happened to Pierre. I spent a week believing I had lost you forever. A few months exploring what might still be possible for us, all of us, feels like a gift rather than a sacrifice. He settled into the chair beside me, his expression thoughtful. "And if nothing comes of it? If you and Pierre decide there's no future there? Then I'll have had the opportunity to know for certain, rather than always wondering what might have been," I said simply. "And I'll have spent time with my son in a beautiful place, learning about half of his heritage that I never allowed him to explore." Richard smiled, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "For what it's worth, I think there's still something there. Between you and Pierre, I see it when you look at each other, even if neither of you is ready to admit it yet." "We'll see," I said non-committally, though his words triggered a flutter of something hopeful in my chest. "We have time now, time we never thought we'd have." The journey to France was considerably more comfortable than my first frantic trip after the funeral. Pierre's private jet provided space to rest, to think, to prepare myself for whatever lay ahead. Richard spent much of the flight working on his laptop, reorganizing Thompson Technologies remotely, while I alternated between reading and gazing out at the endless blue sky, marveling at the strange path that had led me here. When we landed in Lyon, Marcel was waiting with the same black Mercedes, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile at the sight of Richard and me together. "Welcome back, Madame Thompson," he said with a formal bow that couldn't quite conceal his genuine pleasure. "Monsieur Beaumont is awaiting your arrival at the chateau." The drive through the French countryside was different this time. The landscape no longer obscured by grief and shock, the beauty of the Alps fully visible in the clear autumn light. Richard pointed out landmarks he had noticed during his previous visit, his excitement building as we approached Saint-Michel-de-Maurienne. "The vineyard stretches for nearly 300 acres, he told me, leaning forward in his seat. "Some of the vines are over a century old. Pierre's grandfather started with just 50 acres, and each generation has expanded it. The Beaumont wines have won international awards for decades." His pride in this newly discovered heritage was palpable, touching something deep in my heart. For all my efforts to give Richard everything, there had been this essential piece of his identity that I had withheld, not maliciously, but through my own unresolved grief and misunderstanding. As we rounded the final bend, Chateau Beaumont came into view, golden in the late afternoon sun, just as it had been on my first arrival. This time, however, Pierre stood waiting at the entrance, his tall figure immediately recognizable even at a distance. The car had barely stopped before Richard was out, striding forward to embrace his father with an ease that spoke of the connection they had already formed during their brief time together. I followed more slowly, taking in the tableau they created, so clearly related, so comfortable together despite the decades of separation. "Eleanor," Pierre said as I approached, his smile warming his entire face. "Welcome back." "Thank you for having us," I replied, suddenly shy in a way I hadn't anticipated. "Come." He gestured toward the massive oak doors. "Everything is prepared. I thought perhaps a simple dinner tonight after your journey. Tomorrow, if you feel up to it, I can begin showing you the vineyard, the winery, the village. The interior of the chateau was as impressive as I remembered. Soaring ceilings, ancient stone walls, softened by elegant furnishings, windows framing spectacular mountain views. But now, without the shock and confusion of my first visit, I noticed other details. Family photos arranged on a side table, books in multiple languages filling built-in shelves, fresh flowers in crystal vases throughout the entry hall. "This is home," Pierre said simply, following my gaze. "Not just a historic property or a business headquarters. This is where generations of Beaumonts have lived, loved, raised their families." The implications of his words hung in the air between us, that this could be Richard's heritage too, perhaps, in some way not yet defined, mine as well. "It's beautiful," I said honestly. "I can see why you fought so hard to restore it, to build the vineyard into what it is today. Let me show you to your rooms," he offered. "You'll want to rest before dinner." The suite he had prepared for me was on the chateau's second floor, with windows overlooking the vineyards that stretched toward distant mountains. Everything had been thoughtfully arranged: fresh flowers on the dressing table, a selection of books beside the bed, a carafe of water and basket of local fruit on a small table by the window. "I hope you'll be comfortable here," Pierre said from the doorway. "If you need anything at all, you have only to ask." "It's perfect," I assured him, moving to the window to take in the spectacular view. "More than perfect." He hesitated, then added softly, "I'm glad you came, Eleanor. Whatever happens or doesn't happen, between us, I'm grateful for this time." Before I could respond, he was gone, leaving me to settle into this new space, this new chapter of my life that had begun with a crumpled envelope and a plane ticket I never expected to use. Later, as the three of us gathered for dinner in a cozy room that felt more like a family dining area than the formal spaces I had anticipated, I watched Richard and Pierre discussing vineyard operations, vintage variations, the challenges and rewards of winemaking, their shared passion, their similar mannerisms, the easy rapport they had established in such a short time. It was everything I had denied them for decades, everything I had never allowed myself to imagine might be possible. "To new beginnings," Pierre proposed as we raised our glasses, filled appropriately with Beaumont wine from the year Richard was born, a vintage Pierre had apparently saved for just such an occasion. "To truth," Richard added, his gaze moving meaningfully between us. "To family," I completed, the word encompassing everything we had lost, everything we had found, everything we might yet become. As we clinked glasses, I felt something settle within me, a rightness, a sense of pieces finally falling into their proper places after decades of misalignment. Whatever grew from this time in France, whether friendship, romance, or simply a healed understanding between three people connected by blood and circumstance, it would be authentic in a way our separate lives had not been. The crumpled envelope that had seemed like such a cruel joke at the funeral had actually contained the greatest gift imaginable, not just a plane ticket to France, but a passage to truth, to reconciliation, to possibilities I had long since abandoned. And for that, despite all the pain and deception that had preceded it, I found myself profoundly grateful.